The winter of $1941 was a colossal, unforgiving beast that first turned the forests of the Eastern Front to bone, and then clamped its iron jaw around Leningrad. It wasn't just a battle, it was a slow, deliberate strangulation, an experiment in the absolute limit of human endurance designed not by military doctrine, but by the cold, calculated orders of the Wehrmacht High Command, starved the city into submission. Imagine stepping out into that air so cold it felt brittle, like inhaled glass, where every breath was a painful reminder of dwindling calories. This wasn't the heroic charge of newsreels, this was the silence of a city that was eating its own history, grinding up leather and wallpaper paste, desperately boiling every last scrap of sawdust for fuel. Our story begins not with a bang of artillery, but with the quiet, desperate scratching of a pen on thin paper, a voice trying to outlast the frost and the famine. It is January 1942. The city is buried. The snow is not beautiful, it is an enemy, muffling the cries, concealing the collapsed bodies that lay frozen stiff on the Nevsky Prospect, often too heavy, too numerous for the exhausted burial details to manage. We are focused on a small, dimly lit apartment on the fourth floor of a pre-revolutionary building, its windows long since shattered and boarded with salvaged planks. Inside, a woman named Yelena Petrova, a former librarian now an archivist of the city's slow death, sits at a simple wooden table, her breath clouding in the sub-zero air. She is surrounded not by books, but by stacks of civilian diaries, collected weekly by an internal decree to preserve the city's testimony. Yelena knows that when the inevitable end comes, whether by starvation, shell, or the final German push, these pages must survive, a record of the human spirit refusing to surrender to the siege. She is weak, her skin stretched tight over the bones of her face, but her hands, though trembling from cold and hunger, still clutch her own final, small notebook. She writes, her pen moving with agonizing slowness, January 15th. They are collecting the dead now by sledge. I saw a man weep over a piece of bread, a sight more terrible than the shell-shocked soldier I saw yesterday. The enemy outside is cruel, but the enemy inside is the cold, the hunger, the silence. We are fading. But I write this for the hands that will one day hold it, for those who must know that this was not a war of tanks and lines, but a siege of the soul. That diary, along with hundreds of others like it, would eventually be buried beneath the floorboards moments before a German incendiary bomb reduced the building to ashes and icy rubble. They lay there for years, a testament to the moral shock of total war waged against civilians. The very nature of this conflict, from the frozen desperation of Leningrad to the clinical, bureaucratic horror of the concentration camps in the West, was designed to erase not just life, but memory, dignity, and sanity. To truly understand the World War II era, one must look past the flags and the famous generals, and listen to the silence that settled in the wake of the Gestapo's knock, the moment a man realized he was not being taken to a POW camp, but to a vast, mechanized system of death. It is the subtle, profound trauma, the unseen psychological wound, that concerns us. And if you are moved by the search for these lost, brutal truths, by the voices refusing to be silenced by the weight of history, consider joining this journey by subscribing. It helps us dedicate the immense research and effort required to bring these stories to light, giving voice to those who could not survive to tell them. The search for Yelena's diary, this single, frozen flame of defiance, is what opens the door to the vast, terrifying landscape of psychological warfare and ultimate human trauma that defined the Second World War. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, was not just a military campaign, it was a crusade of ideological annihilation, a war unlike any the world had yet known. Its true, terrifying nature was not revealed in the headlines or the sweeping maps of tank advances, but in the desolate, muddy back roads of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. Behind the thunder of the Wehrmacht's armored divisions, operating with a chilling independence, followed the Einsatzgruppen, the special action groups. These were not frontline combat soldiers, they were mobile killing units, the architects of a terror so profound it permanently altered the psychology of mass murder. Their mission was explicitly outlined in the notorious Kommissarbefehl, the liquidation of all political commissars, Soviet intelligentsia, and, most crucially, the systematic, rapid extermination of the Jewish populations in the newly conquered territories. This was the moment the Holocaust shifted from planned persecution to immediate, mechanized slaughter, conducted not in the anonymity of gas chambers, but face to face, often in broad daylight, witnessed by local populations and Wehrmacht soldiers alike. Imagine the atmosphere in a small, isolated village in the Lithuanian countryside, a place where time had moved slowly for centuries. The arrival of the German army brought a fleeting, nervous curiosity. The arrival of the Einsatzgruppen brought only absolute, suffocating dread. These units, comprised primarily of men from the SS, SD, and the Ordnungspolizei, arrived in trucks, their black uniforms stark against the green landscape, their movements methodical and devoid of human warmth. Their psychological warfare began immediately, the cold efficiency, the absolute air of authority that crushed any thought of resistance. They would first demand the immediate registration of all Jewish residents. This was a pattern interrupt in the routine of normal life that signaled the irreversible descent into horror. Neighbors, who had lived alongside each other for generations, suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a rapidly constructed moral chasm, a divide measured in meters but infinite in its implication. The true horror of the Einsatzgruppen was its intimacy. Unlike the later camp system, where the killing was industrialized and often hidden, this was execution by firing squad, carried out at the edge of pre-dug pits, deep trenches that soon became known as killing ravines. Babi Yar, outside Kiev, remains the most infamous echo of this phase, where nearly $34,000 Jews were murdered over 2 days in September 1941. But there were thousands of smaller Babi Yars, scattered across the eastern territories, each one a localized apocalypse. We focus on the psychology of the victim in those final, agonizing moments. The forced march from the Jewish ghettos, temporary holding prisons where hunger and disease had already done the preliminary work of weakening the spirit, to the ravine. The air filled with the sharp, metallic smell of fear, the muffled sobs of the women, the bewildered silence of the children, and the chilling, shouted German commands. The ultimate public humiliation designed to strip the individual of their final vestiges of human dignity, reducing them to mere biological targets before the weapon was even raised. This was a calculated cruelty, designed to ensure that even the memory of the dead was born of shame, not respect. The sheer scale of the atrocity began to wear on the perpetrators as well, a twisted psychological feedback loop. Even the hardened SS men found the face-to-face nature of the mass shootings inefficient and emotionally taxing, a stark, disturbing fact captured in their own internal reports. This fatigue, this need to psychologically distance the killer from the killed, became one of the cold, bureaucratic catalysts for the transition to the extermination camps and the use of gas. But before that, the landscape of the East was painted in this raw, immediate brutality. The sound of the typewriter clicking in war crime offices back in Berlin, meticulously logging the tallies, stood in chilling contrast to the echoing crack of rifles in the lonely forests. Every number was a life extinguished, a world destroyed, and every report was stamped with an approval that came from the highest echelons of the Nazi state. The Einsatzgruppen transformed the act of murder from a crime of passion into a matter of state administration. Consider the role of the local population, the silent witnesses to this systematic destruction. Fear was the most potent weapon. Anyone offering aid, anyone who hesitated or showed a glimmer of empathy, faced immediate execution alongside the victims. This induced a profound societal paralysis, a deep-seated silence born of self-preservation that allowed the terror to metastasize unchecked. The moral fabric of entire communities frayed under the strain. For the victims hiding in the few remaining patches of resistance, the knowledge of the Einsatzgruppen's methods fostered an extreme, almost desperate determination to survive. They relied on fragile, often temporary resistance networks, hidden cellars, and the random kindness of strangers, a flicker of humanity against the overwhelming darkness. Their survival was a matter of inches, of whispers, of hours spent in absolute, nerve-shattering stillness, praying the mud-soaked boots on the Eastern Front would pass their hiding place by. We find a chilling testimony in a recovered page from a Polish non-Jewish resident's diary, dating to October 1941. The Germans drove them out of the ghetto like cattle. The crying was terrible, but then came the absolute silence. I stood behind my shutters. I did not move. I did not breathe. I was safe, but the safety felt like a contamination. I saw a small child drop a wooden toy horse, a soldier kicked it into the mud, and the child did not even cry, he just stared at the sky. That look, that dead, staring silence, that is the true weapon of this war. It kills the soul before the body is even touched. It is a moral shock that I will carry to my grave. This diary entry captures the essence of the psychological front, the internal wounding of the observer, the fear that transcended physical violence. The war had entered the domain of the mind, using terror as a tool for conquest. This initial, raw phase of execution was foundational to the architecture of the Holocaust. It established the principle of mass murder as policy, refined the techniques of psychological control, and served as a horrific training ground for the thousands of men who would soon staff the death camps. The Einsatzgruppen were the dark, ideological pioneers, operating far from the visible front lines, but creating a psychological battlefield that scarred generations. They were the cold, calculating enforcement arm of an ideology that sought to erase entire populations from the earth, not just physically, but spiritually. The final, devastating question is this: what is the capacity of the human mind to process the systematic destruction of innocence, and what happens to the morality of a society that chooses to look away, forced into silence by the very real threat of becoming the next victim? The answer lies not in the numbers, but in the echoes of the abandoned ravines, waiting for the coming chapters to explore how that terror was perfected and industrialized. The terror initiated by the Einsatzgruppen was raw, immediate, and geographically dispersed, but it was deemed inefficient. By 1942, the Third Reich, with its chilling bureaucratic adherence to an impossible ideology, perfected its machinery of death, shifting the horror from the forest ravines to massive, industrial complexes. The name that echoes loudest through the history of human atrocity is Auschwitz, not merely a prison, nor solely a killing ground, but a colossal, interlocking system of forced labor and mass extinction, designed with the cold, precise logic of a factory. It was here that the psychological warfare reached its terrible zenith, where the enemy was not just the guard, but chronic hunger, exhaustion, and the absolute removal of hope. Imagine the arrival. The train journey alone was a deliberate psychological assault, days sealed inside suffocating, overcrowded freight cars, without sanitation or light, the air thick with fear and the unbearable stench of human desperation. For many, this claustrophobic journey was their final transition from being a citizen, a teacher, a tailor, a child, to becoming a piece of cargo, an entity on the vast logistical manifest of the SS. When the doors finally slid open, revealing the searchlights and the barking German commands, the immediate change of atmosphere was profound. Stepping onto the infamous platform, the ramp, at Auschwitz-Birkenau was to step into a different dimension of reality, where the laws of morality and reason had ceased to apply. The process of selection was the initial, devastating blow, a moment of profound moral shock that instantaneously divided families, friends, and the destiny of the arriving population. The victims, dazed and weakened, were confronted by the immaculate, seemingly indifferent figures of the SS doctors, men like Joseph Mengele, who, with a casual flick of the wrist, determined who would immediately vanish into the crematoria and who would be temporarily granted the agonizing existence of a forced laborer. The simplicity of the gesture, the sheer ease with which a life was extinguished or condemned to suffering, was a crucial piece of the psychological architecture. It established absolute, arbitrary power, reinforcing the message that the individual was worthless, his or her survival dependent on the whim of the master race. For those selected for labor, the process of dehumanization was swift and brutal. The confiscation of all personal belongings, a wedding ring, a photograph, a child's toy, was not just theft, it was the systematic erasure of identity and memory. The brutal shearing of hair, the rough scrubbing, and the issuing of the thin, striped uniform were designed to strip away the outward vestiges of selfhood, leaving only a fragile, interchangeable shell. Erasure, the tattooing of the camp number onto the forearm. This was the moment the name, the history, the soul, was replaced by a sterile sequence of digits, transforming the human being into a mere entry in the SS ledger. The victim was now a $7713, an object to be worked until they perished. Life inside the Auschwitz barracks under snowfall was a constant, grinding battle against entropy. The cold iron bars of the camp gate, bearing the chillingly deceptive motto Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free, stood as a monument to the lie that sustained the camp's existence. Every minute was a calculation of survival, how to conserve the meager calories from the watery soup, how to avoid the attention of a capricious capo, a prisoner overseer, how to prevent the thin uniform from being soaked in the ever-present mud. Starvation was not an unfortunate side effect, it was an integral part of the system, a deliberate policy designed to break the will, making resistance an impossibility and turning every inmate's existence into a singular, obsessive focus on the next crust of bread. The average lifespan of a forced laborer in Auschwitz was mere months. The psychological landscape was dominated by constant, pervasive fear. Fear of the appel, roll call, which could last hours in the freezing dawn, often ending with summary executions or beatings for the smallest infraction. Fear of the infirmary, the reverie, which was often simply a stepping stone to the gas chamber for those too weak to work. And most devastatingly, the fear that permeated the air, the smell of burning documents and wet uniforms often mingling with the truly unspeakable odor emanating from the crematoria, a constant, sickening reminder of the ultimate, inescapable end. The smoke from the chimneys was not just physical pollution, it was a profound psychological poison, clouding the inmate's mind with the tangible evidence of mass murder, forcing them to live in the immediate proximity of the fate awaiting them all. Yet, even in this absolute darkness, small, flickering instances of resistance emerged. The sharing of a stale crust, a whispered word of comfort, a clandestine prayer, or the meticulous, dangerous work of documenting the horrors. These fragile acts of dignity and solidarity were the true, internal resistance networks, not of bombs and sabotage, but of maintaining the fundamental human connection the SS was so desperately trying to eradicate. It was in the silence between the brutal commands that the human spirit fought its final, desperate skirmish. The stories of the Sonderkommando, prisoners forced to work in the crematoria, who managed to photograph the process of mass murder, knowing it meant almost certain death, are testaments to the fierce, internal need for the truth to survive, even if the person recording it would not. The Allied soldiers who would eventually witness the liberation of concentration camps were utterly unprepared for the psychological landscape they encountered. They expected battle scars, they found moral ones. When the gates of Auschwitz were finally breached by the Soviet army in January 1945, they found the living, the musulmans, the walking skeletons, and the enormous piles of human hair, eyeglasses, shoes, and dental gold. This sheer volume of evidence, catalogued and processed by the very efficiency the Germans prized, told a story that transcended mere numbers. It told the story of an ideological system that had dedicated its resources and its intellect to perfecting human misery and extinction. This brings us to the core psychological wound inflicted by the system. How does one, having witnessed such absolute nihilism, return to a world where reason and human connection are expected to function? The trauma of the camp was not just the beatings or the hunger, but the inescapable, constant knowledge that the world had willingly allowed such a structure to exist. This profound psychological discomfort, this silence born of witnessing the unutterable, brings us to the realization that the war was fought not only with artillery but also with the systematic destruction of the mind. The Gestapo had another laboratory of terror, one far smaller and more intimate than Auschwitz, but equally effective in its extraction of truth and the crushing of dissent, a world of locked doors and sudden, shattering pain. While Europe was consumed by the fires of ideological warfare and the industrialized terror of the concentration camps, another, equally chilling theater of human brutality unfolded in the Far East. Imperial Japan's ambitions for a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere were built not just on military conquest, but on a foundation of scientific cruelty that rivaled, and in some respects surpassed, the horrors of the European front. Deep within the occupied territories of northeast China, hidden amidst the Manchurian plains near the city of Harbin, lay the sprawling, top-secret facility known only as Unit 731. This was not a battlefield, nor a conventional prison camp. It was a clandestine, state-sponsored laboratory dedicated to biological and chemical warfare research, where human beings were not just dehumanized, but meticulously dissected, infected, and tortured in the pursuit of military advantage. The very existence of Unit 731 was predicated on a profound and deliberate psychological rupture with human morality. Under the command of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant but utterly ruthless microbiologist, the facility operated with absolute impunity, shielded by military secrecy and an ideology that viewed Chinese, Korean, Mongolian, and even Allied prisoners of war, POWs, as mere biological specimens, or Maryuta logs. This term, used by the Japanese personnel, encapsulated the complete erasure of personhood. A log is an inanimate object, devoid of rights, pain, or sentience, existing solely for the purpose of scientific manipulation. This linguistic reclassification was a critical component of the psychological detachment necessary for the unspeakable experiments that followed. Imagine the atmosphere within those heavily guarded, desolate grounds. The buildings, stark and functional, concealed a labyrinth of laboratories, operating theaters, vivariums, and crematoria. There was no pretense of justice, no mock trials, no appeals. Prisoners, including women and children, were brought in from various occupied regions, often under the guise of being transferred to regular POW camps. The moment they crossed the threshold into Unit 731, they entered a world where the very concept of medical ethics was not merely ignored but inverted. Here, doctors, nurses, and scientists, many of whom would later enjoy distinguished careers after the war, their crimes deliberately obscured, performed unspeakable acts in the name of advancing imperial science. Within Unit 731 were a horrifying litany of calculated torment. Prisoners were subjected to live vivisections without anesthesia, their internal organs studied as diseases progressed. They were deliberately infected with pathogens such as plague, cholera, anthrax, and syphilis to observe the effects and develop biological weapons. Limbs were amputated and reattached to the opposite sides of bodies, or frozen solid and then thawed to study the progression of gangrene and frostbite, the same frostbite that ravaged the Eastern Front. In other experiments, prisoners were starved, dehydrated, or subjected to extreme pressures in decompression chambers until their eyes popped out. Test subjects were forced into gas chambers to determine lethal dosages, or strapped to stakes in open fields and subjected to pathogen-carrying bombs to gauge their efficacy. The air in those sterile, fluorescent-lit laboratories would have carried not the smell of antiseptic cleanliness, but the metallic tang of fear, the coppery scent of blood, and the unspoken horror of human beings reduced to living test tubes. The psychological impact on the victims was one of absolute, inescapable terror. Unlike the fleeting horror of a firing squad or the slow starvation in a camp, here the suffering was prolonged, meticulously observed, and deliberately inflicted with a clinical precision. The knowledge that one was not merely going to die, but to be deliberately tortured for scientific data, in a process devoid of any mercy or compassion, must have been an unbearable burden. The silence that pervaded the operating rooms during vivisections, broken only by the quiet instructions of the doctors and the muffled sounds of agony, stands as one of the most chilling testimonies to the depths of human cruelty. The fear was compounded by the fact that the perpetrators wore white lab coats, not military uniforms, blurring the lines between healing and deliberate harm in the most grotesque manner possible. The vast difference in the strategic importance of Unit 731 versus the European camps lies in its purpose. It was an offensive weapon, not merely an extermination tool. The research conducted here led directly to the development of biological bombs, deployed in parts of China, causing localized outbreaks of plague and other diseases that killed thousands of innocent civilians. The Nanking streets after the massacre of 1937 had already shown the world Imperial Japan's capacity for unbridled brutality. Unit 731 demonstrated a new, colder, more systematic form of horror, one wrapped in the guise of scientific endeavor. The ethical implications reverberated across generations, not just for the victims, but for the very concept of scientific responsibility. What happened to Unit 731 is another layer of its chilling legacy. As the Soviet Red Army advanced into Manchuria in August 1945, the Japanese command ordered the complete destruction of the facility, aiming to erase all evidence of their war crimes. Prisoners were executed en masse, buildings were dynamited, and meticulous records were burned. The smell of burning documents and wet uniforms would have filled the air around the disintegrating complex, a desperate attempt to wipe away the stains of their atrocities. However, the Soviets captured some personnel and evidence, and the United States, in a controversial and morally compromised decision, granted many of the top Unit 731 researchers immunity from war crimes prosecution in exchange for their invaluable, albeit blood-stained, research data on biological warfare. This exchange prevented a full accounting of their crimes and allowed many perpetrators to return to positions of influence in post-war Japan, leaving a profound and enduring wound of unaddressed justice. The psychological reverberations of this unspoken deal are immense. For the survivors and the families of the victims, the silence surrounding Unit 731, particularly in Japan itself for many decades, was an additional layer of trauma. It was a collective amnesia enforced by a strategic geopolitical decision, denying the victims their rightful place in history and perpetuating the very dehumanization that defined the unit's existence. The true measure of its horror is not just in the millions of lives lost, but in the deliberate, scientific violation of human trust and the chilling blueprint it laid for future acts of bio-warfare. The question that gnaws at the conscience when considering Unit 731 is profound. What happens to a society when its scientific elite, entrusted with advancing human knowledge, instead becomes the instrument of its most profound degradation, and then escapes the moral reckoning? The answer, etched in the memories of the few survivors and the uncovered testimonies, is a deafening silence that speaks volumes about the ultimate cost of unchecked power and compromised ethics. This dark chapter forces us to confront the fact that brutality came in many forms, some hidden behind the sterile walls of a laboratory, others in the chilling formality of a legal process designed to break the human will. The large-scale, systematic horrors of the Eastern Front and the industrialized death camps were underpinned by a more intimate, psychological terror that thrived in the dark, bureaucratic heart of the Reich, the Gestapo, the secret state police. They were the invisible network of fear, the chilling knock at the door in the dead of night, the force that sought not merely to execute dissenters, but to utterly crush the spirit of resistance before it could even organize. Their operational theaters were not the vast, frozen plains or the smoky crematoria, but the soundproofed, often innocuous-looking buildings in major cities across occupied Europe, which housed the dreaded Gestapo interrogation rooms. These rooms were designed not for swift execution, but for the meticulous, agonizing dismantling of the human will. A prisoner, often a captured member of a fragile resistance network, a courier, a radio operator, a saboteur, would be brought in, already weakened by the shock of capture and the deliberate disorientation of days in cramped, dark holding cells. The true psychological warfare began the moment they crossed the threshold into the interrogator's domain. The room itself was a tool, stark, brightly lit or deliberately dark, often featuring only a table, a few chairs, and the chilling presence of the interrogator and perhaps a stenographer, their figures bathed in an unsettling stillness. The primary objective was simple but devastating: to extract information, names, locations, safe houses, future plans, by any means necessary, and to ensure that the individual prisoner felt absolutely, utterly alone and powerless. The method was a fluctuating tide of terror and false familiarity. Often an unremarkable man in a plain suit would offer a cigarette or a cup of coffee, speaking in soft, conversational tones about the prisoner's family or past life, a terrifying glimpse of normalcy that hinted at the profound stakes of the conversation. The next moment, the mask would drop, replaced by an eruption of sudden, savage violence designed to break the body and, crucially, shatter the mind's ability to maintain its secret. The genius of the Gestapo's methods, and the source of its deep psychological trauma, lay in the unpredictability. Torture was not just physical, it was a calibrated effort to induce maximum psychological discomfort. Endless hours of standing in stress positions, sleep deprivation, the psychological strain of hearing the muffled screams of others from neighboring cells, and the ever-present threat of one's loved ones being brought in for questioning, these were the instruments of the criminal secretor. The most potent weapon was the knowledge the Gestapo possessed, even small, accurate details about the resistance cell that made the prisoner doubt the network's security and even their own comrades' loyalty. The words, the questions, were designed to create internal division, making the act of holding silence feel like a betrayal of self, while speaking felt like a catastrophic betrayal of others. Consider the prisoner's internal landscape. They are a link in a chain, their courage measured not just by their capacity for physical endurance, but by their ability to protect the network. Every hour in that room is a moral crucible. They are fighting not for their own life, but for the lives of every person whose name they hold in their memory. Their trembling hands, their pounding heart, the gnawing hunger, all must be rigidly controlled. The silence they maintain in the face of escalating threats is the resistance's final, desperate act of defiance. The typewriter clicking in war crime offices elsewhere across Europe documented the millions killed, but the slow, agonizing sound of a pencil scratching on a Gestapo log sheet recorded the psychological victory, the moment a name was reluctantly surrendered, the moment a network collapsed. The emotional weight carried by members of the resistance was colossal. They lived in a constant state of high alert, navigating the occupied streets with forged papers, relying on coded whispers and pre-arranged safe words. Every stranger was a potential informer, every sudden police patrol a potential end. When captured, the trauma was magnified by the knowledge that their failure under interrogation meant a death sentence not only for themselves, but for dozens of others. They carried the burden of command, the weight of a nation's hope, into that sterile, terrifying room. Their courage was not the sudden rush of adrenaline on the battlefield, but the sustained, grinding effort to maintain absolute silence despite unimaginable pain. The Gestapo's reach extended far beyond the interrogation room. The mere existence of their headquarters cast a long, oppressive shadow over the population, an omnipresent threat that fostered conformity and discouraged the slightest hint of dissent. This was psychological terrorism on a societal scale, enforcing the surrender of the will long before any actual force was applied. Even the neighbors who reported the resistance member were victims of this fear. They acted not out of malice, but often out of paralyzing self-preservation, a testament to the corrosive power of a police state. The post-war testimonies of the resistance survivors often dwell less on the physical pain, which they often stoically minimize, and more on the psychological torment. They speak of the crushing sense of isolation, the feeling of being utterly abandoned by the world, and the profound, residual guilt over the names they were unable to protect. This specific form of psychological wounding, the moral injury inflicted by state-sponsored torture, lingered far longer than the physical scars. It was a trauma that echoed the experiences of the political prisoners in the POW camps, men captured in battle, forced into labor, and subjected to brutal conditions, where starvation and the arbitrary cruelty of the guards chipped away at their military discipline and their sense of self-worth. In both the Gestapo cell and the POW barracks, the system was designed to strip away the collective identity, whether of the network or the fighting unit, and leave only a vulnerable, isolated individual. The acts of betrayal, whether forced under duress or committed out of cowardice, were not always seen as simple treachery by the survivors. They understood the extreme, unnatural pressure of the Gestapo's machinery. The enduring psychological question left by this dark chapter is how the fragile human spirit can withstand a system designed with such cold, bureaucratic efficiency to shatter it. The few who survived the Gestapo's grip emerged as living memorials to the resilience of hope, their quiet, often painful existence a profound counterpoint to the total ideological victory the Gestapo sought. The ultimate aim of the Gestapo was to ensure that even the memory of resistance was extinguished, that only silence remained. But in that silence, a new kind of trauma was born, one that was eventually confronted by the sight of those who had endured the absolute limit of deprivation, the survivors of the camps, as the war's final chapter was written by the advancing Allied armies. The final days of the Second World War brought a brutal, shattering conclusion to the years of sustained horror. As the Allied forces, the Soviet Red Army from the east, and the American, British, and Canadian armies from the west, drove relentlessly into the collapsing Reich, they stumbled upon the physical evidence of the ultimate crime, the vast network of Nazi concentration camps. The moment of liberation of concentration camps was not a clean, cinematic victory, it was a scene of profound moral shock, a collision between the unimaginable depths of human cruelty and the exhausted relief of those who had witnessed it. For the soldiers, hardened by years of intense combat, the frozen trenches at Stalingrad, the relentless slugging match through Normandy, nothing could have prepared them for the sight. When American soldiers walked into Dachau, or when the Soviets entered Auschwitz barracks under snowfall, they didn't find enemy soldiers ready for a final stand, they found silent, living skeletons, the Musulmans, barely clinging to existence, their eyes holding a distant, vacant horror that transcended physical pain. The air in these camps was thick with a sickly, unforgettable stench, the mingled odors of unburied dead, human waste, and the lingering, metallic scent of the crematoria, a smell that immediately communicated the systematic nature of the reaction of the liberators was often a paralyzed disbelief. They were professional soldiers, trained to engage a recognizable enemy, but here, the enemy was an entire system of bureaucratic sadism. They saw not the spoils of war, but the colossal piles of evidence, the mountains of human hair, the stacks of shoes, the dental gold extracted from the dead. These artifacts were not abstract statistics, they were the concrete, visceral representation of millions of lives annihilated. This was not the expected aftermath of battle, this was the scene of an atrocity beyond the scope of military comprehension. Many soldiers wept openly, others vomited, and some, in a terrifying instant of righteous fury, executed the remaining SS guards on the spot, a momentary, uncontrollable breakdown of military discipline under the weight of an unbearable moral shock. For the survivors, the moment of freedom was not always joyous. After years of sustained trauma, starvation, disease, the absolute loss of dignity, the sudden cessation of terror left a vast, empty space. Many were too weak to move, too emotionally numb to comprehend the change in their fate. The immediate challenge for the liberators was not combat, but the impossible task of providing immediate aid to people whose bodies could no longer process normal food, whose minds were scarred by indelible memories. The sight of a survivor trying to grasp a piece of bread, their trembling hands revealing the absolute deprivation they had endured, was a more powerful anti-war statement than any government declaration. The silence in those moments, broken only by the distant artillery or the sound of a medic's whispered promise, was heavy with the weight of unutterable history. The psychological toll on the survivors was long-term and devastating. They were now free in body, but often imprisoned in mind. The trauma of the Jewish ghettos, the cattle car journeys, the separation from family, all came rushing back, unmediated by the desperate, daily need to survive. They carried with them the memory of witnessing unspeakable things, the burden of being the only one left, and the deep, abiding question of why. They were the living remnants of a world that had been systematically, deliberately destroyed. The road back to a normal life was paved with nightmares, mistrust, and the constant echo of the camp's logic, a lingering presence that would shape their lives and the lives of their descendants for generations. The discovery of the camps also served as the final, absolute justification for the war, a horrific answer to the question of what the Allies were truly fighting against. This reality forced the world, through newsreels and photographic evidence, to confront the absolute moral vacuum at the heart of the Third Reich. The Allied commanders ordered local German civilians to visit the camps, to walk past the open mass graves and the remains of the crematoria, to bear witness. This was a necessary, wrenching act designed to shatter the manufactured illusions and the years of complicity enforced by the totalitarian state, forcing the German people to reckon with the ashes of their own government's reign. This moral reckoning was not confined to Europe. The end of the war in Asia unveiled the horrors of Imperial Japan's own systemic atrocities, from the sexual slavery of the comfort women to the revelations about Unit 731 and the brutality of their POW camps. The sheer scope of global brutality, the frozen, starved city of Leningrad siege juxtaposed with the clinical terror of the Gestapo, the open-air massacres of the Einsatzgruppen compared to the biological horrors in Manchuria, forced a global reassessment of war, humanity, and justice. The resulting Nuremberg and Tokyo war crimes trials were the world's desperate attempt to impose legal order on chaos, to find a language of justice adequate to describe crimes that had deliberately sought to destroy the very concept of humanity. The enduring legacy of this era is the silence that follows. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of profound reflection, the pause required to absorb the full weight of the loss. It is the silence in the faces of the survivors, the stillness in the frozen ground of the execution sites, and the quiet, determined commitment to memory. The war was ultimately a battle for the soul, a struggle between those who sought to render human life utterly meaningless and those who clung to its essential, irreplaceable value, often in the face of absolute despair. The liberation was the end of the killing, but the beginning of the moral challenge. How does a world, having seen the worst it is capable of, rebuild its conscience? The story ends not with a resounding cheer of victory, but with a question echoing in the vast, empty barracks of the liberated camps. After witnessing the capacity for such absolute, systemic horror, what responsibilities do the living carry to ensure that the memory of the suffering is preserved, not to punish, but to perpetually guard the fragility of the human soul against the cold, calculated return of fear and darkness?